I'm not saying it's likely that God exists. I'm saying God has to exist.
Too bad you can't prove it.
Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where we examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how with education, rationality, and reason we can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're taking a look at a video from Luca, who is a content creator that, per his channel bio, focuses on social critique, self-improvement, and philosophy. Taking a quick look through his content, nestled between all the Gymbro and alpha male stuff, it becomes pretty apparent that Luca has a very real problem with people who do not believe in the existence of a god or gods. And he expresses that by pretty much claiming that atheism is the root cause for virtually everything in the world that he does not like. Now in this video, Luca takes on the task of trying to explain why he's not convinced of atheism.
What?
Given that Luca doesn't seem to realize that the response to that is pretty simple, because he's been convinced that a god exists, implies that Luca is working with a malformed conceptualization of what atheism is and what it entails, which is something that he likely picked up from watching apologist grifter videos on YouTube. But seeing as how philosophy is one of Luca's expressed interests here, let's dive in and see exactly how he approaches the topic of atheism, and how he justifies concluding that all atheists are simply lying about what they don't believe.
Why I'm not convinced of atheism? We got the NASA shirt right there.
So already, Luca, you've kind of given away the game. First, atheism is not a position that one is convinced of. It's the position that one automatically occupies when they are not convinced of the truth of and therefore do not believe the God proposition. Second, you making a kind of show of you wearing a NASA shirt implies that you think that there is some entailed connection between one's scientific understanding and one being an atheist, which of course would seem to confirm that you are in fact operating with a misconception of what atheism is and what it entails. But that's okay, Luca. Your misrepresentation and your misinformation are precisely why I make these response videos.
But most atheists would say that they're not convinced of religion, and that, no, I don't believe in Sky Daddy, and we have science now, and humanity has moved on. I'm not convinced of religion anymore. It's an old teaching.
I can see you've actually been listening to some atheist content creators because that was pretty much on the nose. Religious belief systems, while possessing great survival utility in our ancient history, are representative of ancient modes of thinking about reality. Virtually all observed phenomena that were once attributed to supernatural sources have long since been explained naturalistically. There's no logical contradiction in a god not existing, and all the argumentation for the existence of a god is predicated on either scientific ignorance or illogical fallacy. So if you're convinced that a god does in fact exist and you run around claiming that it does, then the burden of proof for that positive claim falls squarely upon you.
But I would actually say that I'm not convinced of atheism. So first I'm gonna tell more practical reasons that may not be as forcing, and then in the end of the video I'll give you kind of the argument that I would use if I were debating this.
And again, you're tipping your hand, Luca. Appealing to the practicality, or what we would call the application, of a particular set of social behaviors that are advocated for by belief in a particular concept is not evidence that that concept that is believed in exists in external reality. In actuality, it's only a means of confirming one's bias by ignoring certain data points while interpreting outcomes through the lens of one's prior held belief. For example, if I were a believer and I happened to get into a massive car accident.
Constable, official vocab guidelines state we no longer refer to these incidents as accidents, they're now collisions.
Right.
If I were a believer and I happened to get into a massive car collision, one in which it was so bad that I became trapped in the vehicle, and while the firefighters are cutting through the wreckage, I decide to pray to my God to help save me. And whilst doing so, the firefighters are able to get me out of the car, and the paramedics are then able to administer the aid necessary to save my life. The question then becomes, did whatever God that I happened to be praying to actually save my life? And the answer would of course be undeterminable. Now what we have confirmed is that the act of praying, much like the act of meditation, can have a strong physiological effect on the body. It can lower blood pressure, trigger the release of calm-inducing endorphins, reduce pain, and delay the body's natural panic response. Essentially, in this hypothetical scenario, by keeping myself calm and focused, I reduce the risk of my panicking and potentially exacerbating my injuries, which in turn provides the first responders additional time critical to saving my life. So we can plainly see that while the application of a belief-inspired behavior can have great utility, the utility itself is not evidence for the existence of the thing that is being believed in, and is only evidence of the powerful effect that strong beliefs can have on one's psychology and physiology.
But I'm not a debater, I'm not a philosopher.
Oh, we know.
I'm just documenting my self-improvement and philosophy journey on this channel.
Well, it's certainly good that you're trying to learn this stuff. Just make sure to maintain your intellectual honesty while doing all that learning, meaning that when you come across something that challenges or even refutes some aspects of your worldview, which I assure you will inevitably happen, don't dismiss it out of hand. Explore it fully and then come to a conclusion that takes all things into equal consideration.
So the first thing is that most atheists live inconsistently to their worldview.
While I have no doubt that some non-believers out there, knowingly or unknowingly, may possess contradictions within their worldview, from my study and personal experience, this usually comes from a lack of understanding of the nuances of philosophy, which can lead them to unknowingly making contradictory statements about themselves and the world, because they're operating with either a layperson's or maybe even a colloquial understanding of these often complex concepts. And to be honest, I don't really fault them for it. In a world of constantly compounding life responsibilities, philosophy is just not one of those fields that attracts a population-wide level of attention. But as someone who does rigorously study this stuff, I have to inform you that atheism itself does not constitute the totality of a worldview, and the position itself does not logically entail holding to any specific philosophical or scientific positions. The only way for the position of atheism to be logically contradictory is if the person who's proclaiming to be an atheist actually possessed direct knowledge of the existence of a god or gods. Basically, it would come down to reality denial. But the only way you'd be able to determine the truth of that is if you had special psychic access to that individual's mind. So really, Luca, when you're talking about contradictions, it's important to note that you're not actually talking about atheism itself, because you're actually talking about other philosophical and scientific positions that, despite what you may have been convinced of, have nothing to do with atheism. That being said, what philosophical positions do you think the position of atheism contradicts here?
And well, most atheists don't ever have any sort of philosophical training.
The door swings both ways.
But most atheists assume things like meaning, assume things like morals, but these things don't exist on atheism.
Okay, so yeah, you're incorrectly thinking that atheism constitutes a complete worldview, and that being an atheist logically entails holding to specific philosophical positions like naturalism or materialism or moral nihilism, which it doesn't. The primary mistake you're making here, Luca, concerns justification. The justification for the atheist position is different from the justifications for things like moral relativism or naturalism. Each one of these has to be explored individually, and it's the sum total of all of these various positions that goes into constructing a complete worldview. So we would have to explore all of the individual parts, not just one of them, to determine if any logical contradictions potentially exist.
But you have to assume these things to have a worldview at all, to live your life, to live your everyday life at all.
Sure, a worldview can have assumptions or axioms within it. What matters is what those assumptions and axioms are and why they are being assumed or held axiomatically.
So most atheists are inconsistent, and most atheists have absolutely no idea what their worldview entails for them. And yeah.
Was that it?
While I will concede that a great number of non-believers out there have probably never given the totality of their worldviews much thought, you're still just repeating your claim. You haven't provided any defeaters for anything that could be held within the non-theistic worldview, and you haven't shown any logical contradictions that would be entailed by being an atheist.
Get on with it.
Yes, get on with it! Get on with it!
That's basically the first reason.
Understanding first, Luca, that you're operating with a malformed conceptualization of what atheism is, you've concluded that the position itself entails contradictions, therefore there are contradictions, but you don't show where any of those logical contradictions actually are. You've only referenced personal meaning and morality, which an individual's specific positions on are not logically entailed by being an atheist. The mistake I think you're making here, Luca, is that you personally hold that certain philosophical positions are necessarily true, and you hold them as being necessarily true because you've been convinced that a God exists and is defined as the thing that grounds them. So you then approach the non-believer's position with an idea in your mind as to what they must hold as necessarily true, and then conclude that the non-believer is being logically contradictory because they don't appeal to the existence of your God, which you've been convinced is a logical necessity for your various philosophical positions to actually be the case. So you're essentially projecting your philosophical positions as being true onto the non-believer, which is straightforward intellectual dishonesty. There's also a much longer discussion here, Luca, regarding what morality specifically is and the difference between objective and subjective. But since you didn't make any specific claims as to what you think is true in regards to those categories, we'll put that to the side for now.
The second reason, this is probably the number one thing. If there's an atheist, I ask them about morals.
Never mind then, I guess we will be addressing it here.
And most people have never even thought of this thing, which is kind of sad. But, the atheists who have really got into this will be able to say like, yeah, morals don't exist.
No, moral nihilism is not logically entailed by being an atheist. Whoever you heard that from is either an idiot or they're lying to you.
But moral relativism. On atheism, there are no morals. There just is.
Moral relativism is not the same as moral nihilism. Holding that moral distinctions are subjectively derived is not the same as holding that moral distinctions don't exist at all. There is a major distinction between these two things, Luca, that you are either completely unaware of or you are deliberately ignoring. Moral nihilism is the rejection of both moral realism, that there are objective moral facts, and moral relativism, that there are relative moral facts.
If you're born on this planet and this planet that smashed into whatever life came out, there is no good or bad. There just is this physical matter that moves.
You're again conflating two separate philosophical positions, this time materialism with moral relativism, neither of which is logically entailed by the other.
There is no right or wrong. And most atheists would like to make some moral claims.
The question is, did you actually inquire as to what their specific philosophical position was? Or did you just assume this false dichotomy and truck on from there?
Oh, you can't do that. Oh, you must support women's rights. Oh, you shouldn't marry a child. Oh, you shouldn't be murdering people. Why?
So the determinations of all of those things are entirely subjective to the individual. But the external reference point that is appealed to in order to make such determinations is usually the moral framework of the society in which one lives. However, outside of the society, each one of those determinations comes down to the individual's natural capacity for empathy, their moral intuitions, and their subsequent moral valuations as determined by their individual experiences.
As a religious person, I do agree you shouldn't do those things, but why? On atheism, why shouldn't you do that?
The simplest answer is because we, as a collective species, want to survive, and that survival is facilitated by our evolved capacity for empathy. Yes, these distinctions do take different forms throughout the various societies that we have built throughout human history, but our continued survival as a species has been the primary driving force through that history.
If you want to do that, why not?
That's the point. The vast majority of humans don't commit certain behaviors because we are an empathetic species. We don't do them to other people because we have the ability to internalize what it would be like if they did it to us. But because the capacity for empathy is not a one-size-fits-all human attribute, there will always be outliers, which is precisely why we have developed methods for dealing with such individuals so that they don't continue to threaten the survival of the society or the species.
And if you say other people don't society doesn't work. Well, why should I respect these things?
The only reason you should respect these things is if your personal desire is to remain a part of and continue enjoying the benefits of the society. Feel free to run around not respecting them if you really want to. Like I said, we have methods for dealing with such individuals.
And better yet, if there's no free will, because on atheism there's no free will.
That's also not the case. Atheism does not entail any specific position regarding determinism, free will, or compatibilism. You definitely have a lot more learning to do, Luca.
You can't even blame me for it.
Sure we can. If free will were the case, we would blame you for the actions that you freely chose to engage in. The justification for that blame would be you having violated the rules of the society. If determinism were the case, we would just be determined to blame you for those actions as equally as you were determined to engage in them. The justification for the blame would just be that it was determined to be so.
If I go on and do all these heinous acts, you can't even blame me on atheism.
We can and we will. While the frameworks that govern behavior within a society are subjectively determined and agreed upon by the members of that society, if your goal is to remain a benefiting member of that society, it becomes objectively true that you adhere to the frameworks of that society. Your choice to either do so or not appears to be completely yours. Just don't bitch about the consequences if they happen to catch up to you.
Because on atheism, you would say that I don't have free will.
And that's what we call the official laugh of Dunning-Kruger.
So, everything I did was determined already. My brain chemistry forced me to do what I did. So you can't even blame me about it.
Like I said, we could blame you for it. If determinism is true, then everything is determined, meaning that it doesn't just stop at your actions. It would also apply to the administration of justice in response to your actions. Sure, any appeal to a moral standard to justify blaming you would be rendered irrelevant, but then any appeal by you to any moral standard to escape that blame would be equally irrelevant. If it's determined you're going to be blamed, you're going to be blamed.
Deal with it.
And finally, the third thing is the argument that I would make, and that is basically, it ties into the free will thing.
Oh, I would very much like to hear how you've been able to determine that free will is actually the case.
So if atheism is true, then we don't have free will.
Piffle. Patently false.
And determinism, so basically the position that we don't have free will, is self-contradictory.
No, it isn't in any way. It is entirely logically possible that we could perceive that we have free will when in actuality we don't, because it very well could be that we simply don't have access to all of the information that would result in us concluding that determinism is the case. So, until we're able to do that, we can act as though we have some form of free will, which is a position that's called compatibilism. You seem to be operating from a false dichotomy.
A self-contradictory position cannot be true, and therefore atheism is false.
So yeah, that's all kinds of wrong. Atheism doesn't entail determinism. Assuming only determinism or libertarianism is a false dichotomy. And the only way for the non-theistic worldview to be false would be for you to demonstrate that a god actually exists. I also feel I should point out that your third point here is really just a repetition of your second point.
So for example, if I'm debating an atheist on free will, well, they're gonna actually have to assume free will to come even debate me.
No, dude, you've got that all messed up. The atheist can logically hold to libertarianism or compatibilism. But even if the atheist were a determinist, they would just be performing an internal critique, assuming the truth of the opponent's position in order to argue against it, which would not entail that they contradictorily also believe that free will is actually the case. I'm starting to think, Luca, that you're less in the process of learning and more in the having just started.
They're gonna have to assume the free will to analyze evidence, to analyze arguments, and to come to intellectual truth. But that doesn't exist on determinism.
Like I said, that's called an internal critique. It doesn't mean they actually hold to your position.
You don't arrive at conclusions because of your intellect and your thinking. You arrive at conclusions because the brain chemistry determined you to arrive at those conclusions.
You ever get tired of being wrong?
The conclusions you arrive at would be because of both of those things. But materialism does not logically entail determinism.
And your debates aren't going to intellectually affect people's minds. The only thing that there is are the brain chemicals that were already determined to act in the way that they act.
While I myself hold that whichever of these is true is currently indeterminable, I have officially determined, Luca, that you still have a shit ton more work to do before you're even able to make a basic salient point on any of these topics. Now, I think bridging the divide here is actually pretty easy when it comes to people in Luca's position. When discoursing on complex topics, it's important to remember that not everybody possesses the same amount of information that you do. Any one given person can know more or less than you do at any given time. So we can bridge the divide by establishing these things before we dive into any level of discourse. Doing that work ahead of time will ensure that each of us is operating with the same level of understanding and will ultimately facilitate greater progress when we have these conversations. Those that don't know do themselves a great service when they allow themselves access to the information that they didn't have, and those who do know do themselves a great service when they do everything they can to avoid gatekeeping. This is what puts so much importance on intellectual honesty and the open and free exchange of ideas, because without these things, we'll just wind up myopically hammering each other with our ignorant assumptions about one another, which ultimately will only serve to compound the issues that maintain and further the divides between us. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, April is World Autism Awareness Month. A link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you saw here and would like to support this channel further, a link to channel memberships and to get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear is also in the description. Once again, a massive thank you to each and every one of you for all your support, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.